Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome to this month's RiskKAN Early Warning Systems for Systemic Risk webinar on behalf of myself, Faith Taylor, and my colleagues Marlene de Ruiter and Brian Golding. The theme of this webinar this week is particularly focusing on the complexity of humanitarian crises and how that interplays with climate hazards and disasters. And we're really delighted to have two speakers from ACAPS join us today. They're going to talk about a range of projects that they've worked on and different contexts that they've worked on. Before I introduce the speakers, I'll just say a little bit about ACAPS, which is a humanitarian analysis organisation that aims to provide independent analysis in humanitarian crises. And they have experience across a range of settings. So firstly, climate emergencies, such as things like response to Cyclone Idai, short-term technological disasters, so things like the Beirut explosion, and then complex long-term crises, such as the Yemen crisis. And part of their work is collecting data, understanding the human and physical drivers, and thinking of future scenarios. So I'll introduce our two speakers. So we have Steve Penson and Nick Parham, both from ACAPS. Steve is a data scientist for ACAPS Yemen Analysis Hub and is based out of Amman in Jordan. His career started in the GIS industry, predominantly focused in water and utilities, whilst working for a range of consultancies. And then in recent years, his focus has shifted towards humanitarian analysis, and he currently works on a range of subjects, from food security to water scarcity to the interlinkages between political economy and complex crises. And Steve is also a volunteer with the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team and Map Action, and is a fellow and chartered geographer with the Royal Geographical Society. Nick Parham is a senior analysis advisor for ACAPS and leads the organisation's anticipatory analysis work. Nick has over 25 years experience in the humanitarian sector, working for NGOs and the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, primarily in Central Asia and the Middle East. Nick's been with ACAPS since 2011 and established and ran the Syrian Needs Analysis Project from 2012 to 2014. And he now supports work across the organisation whilst also deploying rapid onset emergencies, either for ACAPS or the UN disaster assessment and coordination teams. So I will stop speaking and stop sharing my screen and hand over to Steve and Nick, who are going to talk for the next half an hour or so. And please do put questions in the chat. We've got plenty of time for discussion at the end of the presentation. So Steve and Nick, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you. Well, I think the way we're going to do it is I'll start by giving a very brief overview of ACAPS, and then look at one example of the work we've just done, which is in Afghanistan, and then I'll hand over to Steve, who will go perhaps into more detail on Yemen and his work there with the team. Yeah, we're here really to look at the interplay between climate hazards and complex crises, and specifically focusing on Yemen, but I'll do a little bit of a look at Afghanistan as well. And perhaps we'll hope to bring up some of the challenges that we face dealing with climate hazards when they are part of a more complex crisis. So ACAPS, we were set up about 11 years ago as an independent humanitarian project with a focus on analysis that is ideally independent. We're not a response organization, so we aim to inform all levels of decision makers, whether it's up at sort of headquarters and strategic level, or whether it's in the field at the more programmatic level, to give them good independent analysis to inform their response. So how are we set up? Well, we have a consortium, NRC, Save the Children and Mercy Corps, sort of oversee us as and give us a bit of direction. And then we have a global headquarters that's based in Geneva. And we have some hubs that have been around for a reasonable length of time, primarily in Cox's Bazar and in Amman for Yemen. And then we've got other ones that are more recent, Colombia and Ethiopia. And then we have sort of pop-up hubs as they appear for a particular crisis or just for a short term. And the global team looks across the world, monitoring over 100 crises or countries. The hubs obviously focus in on some that we've got specific interest in to do more detailed analysis. And then we have a technical roster of experts that we can bring in to help either with the projects that pop up or to deploy for rapid onset emergencies. And so we look at sort of trend analysis, and we support needs, access, social impact. We do forward-looking analysis, both in terms of risk reports, whether it's a global risk report or specific crisis risks. We do scenario building, normally on request for certain projects. And then we aim to capacity build through our humanitarian analysis program and specific training that people might request. And we maintain various data sets, including the informed risks. And yeah, how do we work? Well, I mean, I think our focus is on good enough analysis. We started years ago with a focus on trying to stop humanitarians from running out into the field gathering data when they didn't need to, and to look at what was already known and focus on the secondary data. Now that's become pretty much standard practice. And so we are trying to make sure that we really do analysis on all the information that's available, and the data that is collected is useful for analysis. We try to ensure that the analysis is joint, in that we involve, other organizations and other people into much of our analysis, and we bring in thematic experts to help with that. I think we've still got a long way to go in the humanitarian community before our analysis is what one might say up to scratch, but we're certainly a good way forward from 10 years ago. So that's a bit about ACAPS. I think going on now, I'll look at Afghanistan, and specifically looking at the scenarios that we published, and some of you may have seen we published at the very beginning of this month. And we use a different approach to many when we're scenario building, called the chain of plausibility approach. And the idea is effectively to, we build on the foundation of knowing where we are, what the current situation is, and then try to understand what it is that's made the situation as it is at the moment, and what it is that drives change within that situation or that context. So that's what we call the variable mapping part, of mapping the relationship between variables and trying to identify which of the variables are the most relevant and also the most vulnerable to change. And then we do the more creative part, where we force ourselves to imagine futures that are distinct from each other, but very, significantly distinct, but plausible, by making assumptions on some of the key variables that we have mapped and seeing how they might unfold. And in a way, the aim very much here is to force us to think of the less probable scenarios as well as the most probable, in order to be prepared, to enable the humanitarian community to be prepared for the sort of unforeseen futures. Now, our steps sort of, well, actually, 2, 3, 4, and 5 really need contextual experts, not necessarily humanitarians, but people who understand such things as the economy, the politics, the environment, the climate, and basically the variables that affect how things change, because they're the ones that can give us a good understanding of how important each one is and how they interrelate, and how plausible certain assumptions might be. And then once we've created sort of the mini scenarios, we choose a few of the most interesting to develop, and that's where the humanitarian experts really put their input into seeing how the humanitarian situation would change as a result of these different scenarios. So that's a brief overview of the process. And then if we go to the next slide, the variable mapping is, and this is a very messy diagram, but it's just to show the sort of thing that we used for Afghanistan. It does become messy and chaotic, but we try to break it up into the different sort of types of variable. As you see there, the environment is we always struggle, especially in complex crises, to really do the environment justice. It's always there with things such as drought or earthquakes or floods or disease, but often it's not considered. They're not considered the major drivers of change for a number of reasons. Primarily because many of them, especially the sort of climate change variable, is so slow, and our scenarios are focused normally between a year and 2 years most of the time, normally around about a year, 18 months. But we look at the interplay of those and then choose the ones that are most significant in driving or resisting change, in order to then make assumptions. If you click again, please, Steve. We make assumptions on how some of them may change, and we use those assumptions then to imagine a future where different combinations of assumptions are true, and that sort of forces the people in the process to think out of the box and not just imagine the most probable scenario. So then I wanted to look, so here in Afghanistan, we have a very complex crisis. We've had conflict, for the last 40 years there, but certainly a very turbulent country during the last 20 years, with significant displacement. But at the same time, if you look at the map on the left, this is the Vegetation Health Index, showing that there's a big problem with agriculture basically in the country, and both the drought in the shorter term this year and the previous one, but also in a way in the longer term, seems to be significant degradation of agriculture in the country. And then and so you've got those two interplays, and in a way when we do a lot of our work at the moment, we sort of acknowledge that climate and livelihoods at least is significant, but it tends to be at that level. It tends to be at the level of livelihoods and access to income, and that being a factor that drives displacement, rather than taking in the long-term effects. But if we consider the Kutchi nomads, who comprise, they estimate about 1.5 million Kutchi in Afghanistan, so that's a significant proportion of the 40 million plus population. They are nomadic, and they are highly dependent on the water. And of course, it's very difficult in Afghanistan over the last years to determine, what drives what conflict, and whether that's the sort of the political agenda, or whether it's the religious agenda, whether it's the ethnic agenda, or whether it's competition over water resources. And I mean, I think if one studies the Kutchis, you know, they traditionally come across the borders, they don't recognize the borders, they migrate from Pakistan in and out, following the sort of seasonal patterns, up into the highlands and then down into the lowlands as the water is available. But it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to move. But the change to their lifestyle is so gradual and it's so difficult to monitor that it's not really studied, and as a result they receive very little assistance compared to other Afghans. So if we go to the next one, so just in summary on Afghanistan, that's a very brief overview, but the challenges we have is that people base decisions to move on multiple factors. And, you know, one thing that I don't think a lot of research has gone into, and certainly not much data is available on, is how much weight do people themselves give to climate-induced factors, you know, whether it's their ability to access their lands or enough water or whatever, compared to all the other factors. And you know how much conflict is exacerbated by climate-related issues. And what's the impact at the household level on some of these climate factors that sometimes are cyclical, like the drought, and it's very easy to perhaps monitor and, you know, report on the fact that I think they said 660,000 Afghans have displaced in the last year or in 2021 as a result of the drought. But what's much more difficult to pin down is what's the long-term impact on people because of multiple failed crops or sort of just the combination of the gradual change in climate, when you've got all the other factors that are coming in that tend to overshadow that, such as the conflict or the change in governance, or now the economic issues, which is the top of everybody's priorities. So, you know, and again, that comes to the third point there, that climate-related research has often got a long-term perspective, whereas humanitarian response and our humanitarian planning is much shorter term. So a question perhaps for discussion later is how can we maximize climate analysis into humanitarian planning? And how much can we include climate analysis in such things as our scenarios and our risks? I'll stop there and hand over to Steve, who'll perhaps give a more detailed and in-depth look at Yemen.
Thanks very much, Nick. Yes, so that's a really quick summary of, in terms of the Afghanistan context and kind of the anticipatory analysis. And then, as Nick said, we'll dig a little bit into kind of what we do at a global level in terms of our crisis insight, but then I'll go into our Yemen context and the work that I do within the Yemen Analysis Hub. And I also saw Fran is on the call as well, so hopefully I get the context right. So I'll dig into that, and you'll probably see there's significant overlaps between these complex crises and the challenges about trying to understand the impact of climate as well. Before I go into the Yemen context, though, I'll quickly highlight kind of the work we do at a global level. So as Nick said at the start, we have a HQ based in Geneva and also analysts based around the globe who essentially monitor on a daily basis over 100 humanitarian crises. And this is called the Crisis Insight methodology. And we have something called the Informed Severity Index, which looks at multiple dimensions, so climate being one of these sections, but obviously it looks at a wide range of factors such as access to services, people in need, geographical situation, operating environment, etc. So I think as Nick highlighted, climate definitely plays a part in terms of the humanitarian response, but when it comes to the more complex crises, it's a smaller section, and it's something that, to understand the interlinkages and maybe understand better way of bringing climate science into humanitarian responses, is something that could be of interest as well, especially as we look more long term. So yeah, feel free to investigate the Crisis Insight. The data is available on the website and also on the Humanitarian Data Exchange, which is a really good website for accessing humanitarian data, hosted by OCHA, but it's a very good place to access all of that information available. So as we mentioned, we have the Global Hub, but we also have our Analysis Hub. So Nick mentioned the guys in Cox's Bazar, Tigray, Colombia, and our biggest hub is the Yemen Analysis Hub, based out of here in Amman, in Jordan, but with some present occasionally inside Yemen itself. So for those of you who are not familiar with Yemen, it's a country south of Saudi Arabia and just to the west of Oman. The capital city being Sana'a, which is kind of based in the center of the western part of Oman. And currently Aden is like the de facto capital city at the moment as well. It's a very complex crisis heading back quite a few years, but before the conflict, I suppose Yemen is very much known for kind of the amazing food, one of the oldest civilizations within the Middle East, and also for those of you who have heard of like mocha coffee, that's essentially where the coffee beans come from. So it's really mountainous country as well, quite availability of quite productive land as well. But as you can see on the right hand side, in terms of our crisis analysis, we do it at a global level. You can see it's one of the most severe crises. We split it into a complexity very, very high as well, climate feeding into it. So very quick summary, and I'm no means an expert. Our team consists of kind of both international staff, and we've got Yemeni staff and people based around the globe as well. So they probably have a lot more context, but hopefully I can start to do it justice a bit. But the conflict escalated in 2015, and it's between the internationally recognized government of Yemen and the de facto authority, also known as the Houthis. And on the right hand side here, you can kind of see the areas of control that kind of manage the currently situation in the country. Over 18,000 civilian casualties, 4.3 million people displaced, and I'll touch on that in a little bit, and 20.7 million people in need, and severe food insecurity as well. So it's a very complex crisis. Climate does feed into it, and I'll definitely bring in the fact about water, and water keeps on popping up in all of these different contexts as well, be it Afghanistan, be it Tigray, be it over in Yemen as well. So there's something to discuss as well. So our areas of focus, if there's a bit of humanitarian jargon which looks into the triple nexus, that's what we call, but essentially what the response in Yemen is starting to do is there's three sections. There's the humanitarian response, and then there's this longer term kind of development, and also the peace building as well. And so these three factors kind of combine together. Humanitarian response tends to be kind of that shorter term side of things, but as the conflict has continued, we've started to look a little bit more into kind of more sustainability as well. But we'll go into the fact that it's very difficult to build sustainability when you don't have an established government that is able to enact it, but we'll touch upon that as well. So our areas of focus tend to be broad, so anticipatory and risk analysis, and we'll touch upon the Marib scenario that Fran, who's on the call, led on. There's an environmental disaster that's potentially happening off the coast of Yemen. It's less climate based, but it is related to an oil tanker that is at risk of basically breaking apart and causing a very massive environmental disaster. So we've done assessment of that. But the main thing related to climate tends to be the food and water security, which in Yemen is very complex and mainly comes down to the political economy more than climate. But in the future term, there is this development look to see how the productivity in terms of the food and water scarcity could be improved. And then we also look into the social impact and protection, and Hind, who's in our team, and Mays as well, they very much look into kind of the social impact and the actual impact of people in need. So rather than having a blanket kind of, this is how many people in need, it really digs into the kind of the roots, the tribal links between people, and etc. And then there's always this question, how does climate play a role in the Yemen conflict? And we put the COP in happening next week, but obviously Yemen is such a complex scenario. Before you can even think about sustainability in the future and climate change, we need to help to establish kind of this piece and have that ability to have those discussions. So very quickly, I won't go through all of this, but the kind of analysis we do, we look at kind of the impacts of food supply chains, kind of the impact of imports into the country. And one thing to mention when it comes to Yemen is that 90% of the food is imported, which means that productivity of the land is not a significant factor currently, but because of all that food being imported, it means it's very much reliant on the politics of the ports and the surrounding countries and having that ability to come in. And so there are discussions about how productivity of land could be basically shift away from that 90% reliance on imported food and start to use productivity of land. And then we start to look into the impact of displacement. So looking into those scenarios about what happens if one of these significant areas is taken, and what is that impact in terms of displacement and the humanitarian impact as well. And the final bit before I move on is very much looking into the economy. So a lot of these complex crises, if you're thinking about Afghanistan, but as well as Beirut as well, the economy is a significant factor to food insecurity. That alongside climate are one of the main factors. And I would say that hyperinflation, meaning people can't afford food, is one of the major issues within Yemen, and our analysis tries to identify scenarios and highlights that to different decision makers, specifically within the World Bank and IMF, to be able to kind of inform policy in terms of trying to fix it. We won't go into too much detail. There's a lot to discuss on the economy side of things, but maybe less relevant. So a few more slides before I open up, looking at the time. So in terms of the climate in complex crises, we say we tend to focus on climate as a secondary impact. The complex crises tend to focus on the secondary impacts of climate. And what we can say is that climate exacerbates displacement caused by conflict. So the vast majority of displacement, so that is people moving from their hometown to another location, the vast majority of displacement in Yemen is caused by conflict. But if we think about how people decide where they move to, obviously the more displacement they have, and there is multiple displacement in Yemen, there is a risk that people move to areas which are at high risk, be that through flooding from the wadis. There are no rivers in Yemen as such, but they have the wadis essentially, and there are high risks of floods. And so what we can say is that the climate exacerbates displacement, especially as water scarcity continues to grow and unsustainable kind of practices are happening as well. And one thing that I mentioned earlier as well is that climate is a key part of the future. So if you currently think about the humanitarian response, very much short-term kind of firefighting, trying to ensure that people in need have access to the capability to be able to survive essentially. But this longer term kind of risk, I suppose, is that the longer the humanitarian and the war goes on, the more unsustainable practices are adopted. And so what we're starting to see is, for instance, groundwater extraction with Yemen is a significant issue at the moment. And there's this quite niche example where there's been quite a lot of investment in solar power into the country to reduce reliance on fuel. That's another section. But actually deploying these solar panels in order to encourage water extraction, because there is no kind of mechanism to stop unsustainable extraction. What we've seen is that there's been a significant increase in groundwater extraction, and that could have significant effects in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's something that has started to be highlighted, and something that different teams are starting to look into as well. Another area of interest as well, so I mentioned that 90% of food is imported into Yemen. What we actually find at the moment is a lot of the land is currently used for the production of a drug called CAP, which is essentially like it's a very high stimulant essentially. But what we found is that the farmers in country, it's economically beneficial to produce CAP over other kind of food items. Which has led to kind of this reliance on imports into country. And so this development perspective starts to look at how can we economically incentivize people to start to grow more sustainable food. Specifically, that CAP takes a ridiculous amount of water to produce as well. So that kind of exacerbates the issue with groundwater extraction. So that's the kind of ideas behind it. And obviously, you've got an ineffective emergency response to natural disasters. If you think about in-country disaster response teams to floods, to earthquakes globally, a country that is in conflict obviously does not have that response in place. And so it was a difficult response. And so that's one thing. It's difficult to be sustainable without peace, which is why you have these interlinks between humanitarian development and peace. Those very much play into each other. And that's something that over time we're starting to see a lot more thought into the kind of development practices going ahead within Yemen as well. 2 more slides before I kind of open up to discussion. So one area that I mentioned is the food, water and energy security. As I said, 90% of food is imported, but a lot of this issue is caused by currency depreciation. And so Yemen's a very interesting case where you've got 2 central banks essentially, and the currency depreciation means that people get their salaries in, but each month that money is worth less, which means they have to cut down on food and they have to adopt new coping strategies to be able to survive essentially. And that is something that is out of control at the moment in terms of this depreciation. We've seen about a 25% depreciation over the last month or so. So it's a very significant issue at the moment, more so potentially than these kind of long-term climate effects. And then we also have, in normal times, Yemen has some of the most productive oil in the world, I suppose. And so there's a lot of oil export revenues that have happened historically. And there's interesting discussions there in the future about if we're thinking about climate change, if we're thinking about kind of this global response, then this oil export revenues, what are we going to do with it? And there's a discussion about in the short term, is it better to enable the export revenues again of oil in order to stimulate the economy? And there's discussions about that as well, which is quite an important issue. And then finally is the complexities behind food security, land protection and the war economy. And so because of the imports, there is definitely much incentive for certain organizations as such, or certain stakeholders, to ensure that food continues to be imported into the country because that makes significant profit. And so there's all of this analysis behind it. And we have to bear that in mind as well when it comes to future development and kind of sustainability within country, because you need to be able to incentivize those kind of players to kind of move away from the very lucrative war economy and look into the benefits of peace. Something that Fran's been doing recently just starts to look into, okay, yes, you make this much money currently in terms of the war, but if we incentivize, made more sustainable and move towards peace, what kind of economic benefits could you have there? And that's an interesting thought in terms of how we can get a more sustainable side of things. And the final thing, so climate change is only a small driver of food and water scarcity, but as I mentioned, in the future, that extreme groundwater extraction could start to have severe future issues. And the final one, so we talked about displacement as well, and as I mentioned, the conflict-driven is main cause of displacement within the country. But as I said, climate exacerbates that displacement further. And what is really useful in the future is to kind of be able to anticipate displacement. So can we say, where are people going to do? What is the situation, or what is the geography of that specific place as well? So if we say that Marib, for instance, where there's potential significant displacement happening in the next few weeks, is understanding where are people likely to move? Are they likely to go east? Potentially not, because that is purely desert. Are they more likely to go south? We don't know because of who has taken control of that area. So being able to understand those complexities and to anticipate is something that climate can start to play more of a role in. But it's very important to help the humanitarian teams in terms of where should we distribute and where should we try and gain access to in order to help people in need. And it's also understanding the coping mechanisms as well. And as I said, this longer term vision, this kind of understanding, okay, if there's going to be severe water scarcity in the next 5 to 10 years, where are people going to displace to, and can we put mechanisms in place to kind of understand that as well? And two organizations that are worth mentioning, IOM, who are UN migration team working very much in Yemen, and IDMC, who are a bit of a sister organization to ACAPS as well. Something to look into. So just to summarize, I think we've kind of taken a look at, Nick looked into the Afghanistan example, and then we kind of touched upon the complexities behind the Yemen conflict and how things like food security, water scarcity, and climate feed into the crises, but maybe within this broader sense. But the key questions is like, how can climate science be made more accessible to humanitarian responders in complex crises, and also development actors as well? And to really understand how much weight climate-induced change is being given to kind of displacement, as well, to understand that. To understand how climate-related issues can contribute to conflict and be exacerbated by conflict. To really understand that is a key issue. And then we mentioned this in Nick's piece as well. So what about that long-term perspective? How can we get humanitarians to look at that longer term perspective? Because humanitarian response is very much short-term, but climate analysis is much longer term. And if we can start to bring those worlds of humanitarian development and also climate science together, then I think that could be quite impactful. So it's very broad discussion. I hope people found that of interest, probably a bit different to your regular talks you have on the subject, but hopefully you can see how complex crises do take climate into account, but how much it is a very much more complex and situation as well. So thanks very much, and pass back to Faith maybe, and Nick. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Steve and Nick, and virtual applause to both of you. We really appreciate you coming to speak to a more kind of climate and disaster focused audience, and I think these discussion questions are really interesting in terms of how we can better connect these two sort of bodies of research. And I particularly thought there was a diagram, I think it was a scenario diagram that Nick showed of the sort of complex web, where you mentioned that perhaps the environment side is less fleshed out. And I think, you know, we as a community have been doing a lot of work on the sort of multi-hazard interactions and maybe some of the kind of primary impacts. But I think connecting that to this sort of more complex web of the sort of social interactions, I think there's a lot more work to be done there. So we have about kind of 15 minutes for questions, and I can see that 2 have come in the chat already. Mark van den Homburg, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question. Oh great, I can see you put your camera on, so I'll hand over to you.
Okay, sure, thanks. Yeah, and thanks Steve and Nick for the presentation and for your very, let's say, holistic approach, where we are often working kind of on a silo approach. So I think we can learn a lot from that. Yeah, my question was that it seems that if you talk about, let's say, climate-related issues, that you're mostly referring to gradual changes over time, or to, let's say, the impact of climate change, but not so much a focus on the there may be higher occurrence or intensity of extreme weather events. That's also a bit, I have to say, the focus, our focus. We are working on anticipatory action for extreme events. So yeah, my question is actually, can you also take this into account, or do you consider these shorter events to let's say, to short term?
I'll jump in there. I think no. I mean, we do in some contexts consider the shorter term events and the very low. I mean, we may be asked to do, for example, scenarios for the next 6 months, year in a country where we are looking at impacts. Yeah, we did one back in November 2015. We were looking at what would be the impact of La Nina following the El Nino in Indonesia. And so we were looking at, different scenarios for that, in a way, the second and third harvests at that time. I think but what's happened more recently is we tend to be, when we're in complex crises, and that's where we do the majority of our scenario building nowadays, and most of the bigger humanitarian disasters are all complex. It's always the conflict side of things and the political instability and the economic vulnerability that are bigger drivers. And I think the trouble is they then mask or overshadow any climate issue. We had, we knew when we were doing the scenarios for Afghanistan this time that we had floods earlier in the year in some areas, and then we had a drought in much of the country. Yet still, the focus is always on the drivers that are gonna, all the other drivers, I mean, I think in Afghanistan, it's interesting because the droughts have hit an awful lot of people, the rural people, quite hard. And so that was taken into account. But in many scenario exercises, we tend to look at the scenarios, and the main variables we look at will always be something like politics, economy, conflict, and only in a specific country where we are focused on, monsoons or floods or something, will we look at that. Otherwise, the climate risks tend to be put in compounding factors. So we would have 4 or 5 scenarios based on, whatever it is, changing governments, and we would have a little paragraph at the end saying, obviously, if there was a flood or an earthquake or something like this, that would compound the problems in this way. But rarely does it take center stage. And it's a bit of a failing of ours, but it's also a real struggle to get the sort of experts on the climate into the workshops that we have. I mean, we're about to have one next month for Ethiopia, and at the moment we have no identified expert on climate for Ethiopia to join the workshops.
Slightly build on that just very quickly as well. So if we start to compare, for instance, climate-based displacement against conflict displacement. And so in the Marib scenario I mentioned earlier, there's a estimated 500,000 people could be displaced if the city is taken. Whereas in terms of, there are consistent floods that happen every year within Yemen, and there is always displacement there. But when you start to compare the potential 500,000 caused by the conflict compared to, I can't remember exact numbers, a few thousand, that's I suppose where that balance between climate being only a section of this complex crisis comes into account.
Thanks, Steve, Nick. And Mark, did you want to respond to that at all? Or does that answer your question?
No, that's very clear, actually. Well, I know that maybe one question in relation to how the weighing by experts is being done, but I think this is already partly an answer, actually. But yeah, the process around how you, if you have these different variables, how if you have workshops in countries, is there a lot of like easy consensus, or you have a lot of dissensus to determine which variables are the most important?
Really interesting. Yeah, there's normally quite a lot of dissension or no, normally one or two variables would be quite clear, but I remember I can't remember, there was one workshop, one environment where the participants said, no, we definitely need water included. It's very important here, you know, and that affects, I can't remember which it was that it was included. And, you know, we can have more key variables, but the problem is the more you have, the more complex the process becomes. And actually, I'm more and more coming to the view that actually the way to do scenario building is actually to have a very small group of, you know, half a dozen experts in scenario building who really understand the context, i.e. having had lots of key informant interviews, who can then create some scenarios, some possible futures, and then you take that to a wider audience of people to say, okay, if the future went this way, what do you think? You know, and maybe to validate that as a possible future, to say how plausible it is, but also then to say what will be the consequences. Because a lot of people, when we run this exercise, a lot of people, well, some people cannot cope with considering a future that is not considered the most likely, the most probable, you know, or very probable. And they get hung up on that. And other people sort of always try to bring the same, all scenarios back to the same sort of one, because that's the one they favor or something. So but I think the key is that I would like more experts in the context, in the creation of the possible future. And then when we develop the scenario and we look at the impact, we have, you know, anyone who's interested sort of thing. But there are the two different stages that require two different sets of expertise.
Thanks. It makes me think we could actually do a webinar on sort of scenario building and expert elicitation, just kind of focusing on how we do that. Brian, I saw that you've got a question. I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. It's actually along the same lines, but perhaps going a bit further. I was thinking of events like the recent tropical cyclone landfall in the, I'm not sure if it actually hit Yemen, but it was pretty close. And obviously there is a process for warning and responding to that specific weather event, which will be influenced by the conflict situation and so on. So it's almost the other way around. In that situation, the weather event comes first, but the response and the warning needs to be influenced by the broader and longer term situation. It may be outside your scope because it's a very short term event, but I wondered if you'd like to comment on that.
I don't know if I can probably hand over to Nick quite quickly, because the work he does with UNDAC is probably quite related to that. Nick, do you want to mention?
Yes, sorry, I just interrupted briefly. I think, I mean, there are two ways. I think scenario building should be able to do that. We should be looking at, you know, what would, for example, in Yemen, okay, if we have a natural disaster hitting a part of Yemen, what would that do? What would we need for the response? And I mean, certainly in Afghanistan, they've done that in the past in that they pre-position a lot of relief supplies right up in the north because there are earthquakes up in Badakhshan or somewhere. And, you know, again, you could do the same thing prior to so that you are not so dependent on the local authorities or the security context, because local responders can do more. But again, it depends, you get a highly volatile situation like Yemen or Afghanistan, that even the pre-positioning of, you might scenario build and say, well, what happens if we get another, earthquake in Afghanistan next year, or a sudden onset, or a cyclone in Yemen? But then I suppose the challenge would be, what could we do that wouldn't get scuppered by the conflict? And I think, but certainly that scenario building, I think, can help, and it has helped in the past. But the one thing I might say is that the humanitarian community is still very in its infancy in using scenarios. And risk. It's trying to get better, and ACAPS, I think, is still sort of at the forefront of that. But it tends to be that the wider humanitarian community only ever consider a scenario because it's written into part of their annual planning process. So they look for scenarios around about September when they're planning for the humanitarian program cycle bit, and then they forget about them until next September, rather than constantly monitoring them or redeveloping them. If that answers part of that question, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess so. So, I mean, if we're thinking of the role that the international weather forecasting and warning agencies play in warning countries, clearly it's difficult for them to take account of the details of how those warnings are going to be received in a conflict situation, or for that matter, in a COVID situation, which has a similar or somewhat similar effect. So you have your long-term scenario building of how the exposure and vulnerability might change, but then you've got a short-term event where you've got a very definite prediction of a natural hazard. And we know how, or we have some approaches to dealing with that in a normal situation, but in a conflict situation, I guess it's a different matter, and I'm not sure that we have the two parts of that equation getting sufficiently in contact to come up with the best answers in terms of pre-preparing, but also responding.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a recent example of the earthquake over in Haiti. So obviously that's quite a severe conflict context. It's a very unstable country, and I suppose in that scenario, what happened is that the disaster hit, and then there was that mechanism to call in like the UNDAC teams, the UN teams to help with the initial disaster response. But that relies, I suppose, on the government calling on UN assistance to come in and set up kind of the disaster coordination teams. And so that the MAP action teams were involved as well within that response. But it very much relies on being invited into country. If that country doesn't have the capacity to support, then I suppose that's when you can call in kind of the UNDAC teams to support with that. And Nick's got a lot more experience in that section, but I think that there are mechanisms in place for UN teams to be deployed in kind of unstable scenarios like Haiti, for instance.
Yeah,
thank you.
I was just thinking the other thing is the Forewarn group, who are sort of advocating this, forward-based financing, or to respond in advance of a crisis and get some funding to NGOs in order to normally give people cash prior to an event happening. How that, presumably if people are operating in conflicts and situations, there's a possibility to do that then prior to an extreme weather event or something, because if they've got access beforehand, they should be able to get out some sort of preparatory response, normally by way of sort of funding to people in advance. But actually, whereas after the event, the security may have degraded as well. I don't know. But I mean, I'm not sure how much that happens in conflict environments at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. We're nearly out of time, so and I know there were a few other questions that had come through when people had registered, but just to highlight, I think Steve and Nick were quite interested in kind of cutting across disciplines, and actually, Steve, if you wanted to put the discussion questions, if you share them again, if you don't have a question, but you might have a reflection on one of these thoughts, if you want to put that in the chat, or follow up with myself and Marlene, or Steve and Nick after the event, please do. So I think we're pretty much out of time. So I'd like to thank Steve and Nick again for joining today, and I hope the discussion was useful for both of you as well. We certainly learned a lot from the event. I'm just going to share my screen again to share the information about our upcoming webinars. So generally the webinars are on the third Thursday of the month. So we've got ones coming up in November and January. The November topics to be confirmed. This event, I'll check with Steve and Nick first, but we generally try to share the recordings on YouTube, so do feel free to catch up there, and do get in touch with us if you've got ideas for future webinars, or if you'd like to collaborate. So thanks again to Steve and Nick, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the end of November.
Thank you, everybody,
for having us.
Thanks both. That was super interesting.
The questions as well.
Hey, did you stop the recording? Because then it will save it as soon as we exit the call.